was born in 1960 on the island of Taiwan. Had I been born on the mainland, this is fine, I think. Can you hear? Oh. I was born in 1960 on the island of Taiwan, and had I been born on the mainland, I probably would not have survived the Great Famine that was raging across the land, taking somewhere between 30 to 40 million lives. And one among those lives was my great-grandfather, who was kicked off his estate and made to wander a beggar. For the past 14 years, I take it upon myself to bring justice to the absurd cruelties that he had suffered, but also for a string of other people at a very dusty level of history. Next, please. I came to the United States via Japan in 1967. I lived in Japan for 2 years and was an avid manga reader. 1967 was a year in which I began moving away from my own culture and heritage, because being Chinese in no way helped me to fit in outside the home. Being Chinese meant all sorts of uncomfortable things, like inheriting the memories of war, of hunger, of the cynicism of language from an ancient culture. But it took a physical return to China in 1986. I had wanted to go to China in my college years, but I was forced to go there because of a stalker, a boyfriend who became abusive and was stalking me and returned to Carmel and harassed me further there. So I needed to go to China to find a safe place. And I was studying art there. I traveled deep into the countryside along the Gobi, in the Gobi Desert, into Hunan. I visited my grandparents who were in their 80s. And I was also privileged to be an eyewitness to the Tiananmen massacre. Next, please. Late in 1989, having stayed in China for 4 years, I decided to come home. I was exhausted. It was Kafkaesque on the streets of Beijing. PLA, People's Liberation Army soldiers, were giving free haircuts to the citizens, whereas other troops had massacred people outside of the Tiananmen Square. So I came home exhausted, and my parents said to stay home and rest for a year and reach a level of peace many layers deep so that I would ultimately know what I needed to do in my life. And this is exactly what happened. My father started telling stories, so did my mother, but his was compelling, and so I started to sketch these vignettes and to write stories. In any case, Chinese lend itself very well to poetry, and my book had started out as a prose book with full-color art, but I had to boil it down from prose to comic strip, captions and word bubbles. And you'd think, well, you'd lose a lot because prose is so much longer, but actually I found in the process that in the process of poetry, I made the work much stronger. Certain things had to be cut out, but what remained was very pungent. So, Janine, we can click through the rest of it pretty quickly. Okay. My great-grandfather, my father, my great-grandfather telling my father, a person who has no knowledge of the past is but an animal dressed up in human clothes. And so he related the House of Young's history, and my father was able to tell these stories to me in the last 20 years. Go ahead and click pretty quickly through these because they're kind of long. I gave a fresh copy to my father after the books arrived in May. This was just out. And he likes to annotate, so at the end he wrote a poem for me and wrote it directly in the book. Please go ahead and just continue with the images. 来空去空，一切空，佛性道心无相踪。万古长河永流去，瓦霜生命太匆匆。And very roughly translated, it means we come into this world with empty hands, we leave empty-handed, or we leave empty. And the disciple of Buddha and disciple of Taoism must leave his heart empty of images. The 10,000 years long river is not the same this moment as it was a second ago, and the frost upon the roof vanishes very quickly. So life, everything passes. Don't try to hold on to anything. So it's a story, my father's telling me stories, and these are the stories of men and women who have disappeared. And I felt that it was important to rescue these stories. I had seen my friends in China who were silenced by the authorities, and I knew that I had to come back and bring these stories to life. Stories make us individuals. They make us free. If you are an individual, you can be sitting in jail as a dissident, and you would still find a measure of comfort. Okay, these are images that I usually show to students. My first earlier piece, not very good. So just wanted the kids to know that, we all start somewhere. Next, please. Next, please. My art teacher in Carmel, when I was 11 years old, when we first moved there, and I was a lonely child. This is how I usually work, not black and white, but color. But I love black and white because it has its own parameters and problems to be solved. Point Lobos, where the Chinese shipwrecked in the 18th century and opened up, or started up a little community. This is how I worked on the mainland using ink wash paintings. My studio. Tools of the trade. Pigment markers, so that your typical Sharpie will turn blue or purple in time, but this will stay true black. And I use gouache instead of India ink because gouache is more flexible. It doesn't cause the paper to curl. Ames guide to help lettering. Piece and process, progress. Tricks of the trade. I don't do this anymore because my hands have grown pretty steady. I don't need to tape it off to make a sharp, clean edge. And this little show on the living room floor because I feel rich after doing a dozen or so pieces, and I want to have a feel for what I've done and the flow of things. An attempted jacket art didn't take, neither did this one. Fini after 14 years. And then Matt, our FedEx man, came to take the box away. My great-grandfather, the hero of this story, he is a King Lear-like figure to this book. My family in Tianjin after the Japanese had attacked Manchuria. My father is right there. My parents during their engagement. My dad and I about 16 years ago. My parents more recently. And this is the last image. The next graphic novel is sort of part one, or sort of part two, part B of my graphic novel. And it's called Umbilical Cord. And it takes place in Taiwan, which was a colony of Japan for 50 years. And thus my mother's side of the family are wearing kimonos. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.